We are starting a new series today that we are just calling Big, and being this being Christmas season, the time of year where we're thinking about gifts. Let me just clarify one thing. We are not talking about big gifts that you can get, or the best things that you could possibly get this year. Actually, the thing that we're talking about is we're talking about family, we're talking about kids, we're talking about those that we have some influence over. And kind of the big question that we're asking throughout this series is, what are the big ideas? So the next 3 weeks we'll look at 3 ideas. What are the 3 big ideas that we need to instill into the lives of those that we have influence with, especially our kids or our grandkids, or if you're a teacher, your students, or maybe it's nephews and nieces, or whoever it is that you have influence with, influence over. But that's the question that we're asking. What are the big things that we really need to instill into the lives of those that we have influence over in the coming weeks and in the coming months? So in order to get us started, I just want to ask you a question. And I'm guessing that you may not have thought through this before. Maybe some of you have. Maybe you actually have this written down. But I'm guessing not all of us have thought through this. And so here's the question. What are your goals as a parent, or as a grandparent, or as a teacher? What are your goals? What are the things that you're aiming at? What are the things that you hope to accomplish as a parent or grandparent or teacher? Most of us, we just kind of go along with what society tells us. And so there are certain things that I think all of us just kind of shoot at these things. And we probably would agree that for the most part, we want to help raise kids that are healthy and happy and eventually independent, right? Because eventually we want them to be out of the house. And so that's something that's important. But, we say, well, how happy. Well, we buy them big gifts at Christmas and do that kind of stuff, spoil them and those things, right? And then we ask the question, well, how do we help our kids live a healthy life? Eat candy at Christmas, even though we give them tons of chocolate, how do we help them live a healthy lifestyle? And so we tell them, you can't eat all of this at once, right? You have to space it out. That way you'll be healthy over time, and then again, like I said, all of us have the idea that eventually we want those that we are helping to influence, those that we are helping to raise, to become independent, to become adults that can do things on their own. And so at that point, we will just invite them over for Christmas rather than having them actually in our house at Christmas. We'll just invite them over and we'll give them things that they need rather than things that they want. So that's when they start getting socks for Christmas and t-shirts and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what society sets out for us as the typical standard for the way that we interact with those that we're influencing. And so we ask ourselves the question, how can we raise happy, healthy, independent kids? But this morning, let me just ask you this. What if that's not the best goal? That's not a bad thing, right? But what if that's not the best thing that we could be doing as parents and as grandparents, as teachers, for those that we are influencing? What if there is something that is greater? What if there is a higher standard? What if there is something that we are missing, maybe almost entirely, that we should be instilling in our kids? And by the way, if you're saying, you know what, I'm stuck for the next 30 minutes and I don't have kids and I don't have grandkids and this doesn't apply to me, this actually is stuff that, even if you're not teaching it to others, maybe this is stuff that you should be living out, okay? So I think it will have application for all of us this morning. But jump into the book of Mark to start looking at the first big idea that we need to implement and instill into those that we have influence with. And if it's been a while since you've been in the book of Mark, let me just give you a quick overview of what this is like. The book of Mark is a little different than some other books in the New Testament. The way that I think about the book of Mark is that it's a man's book. And you may say, I've never thought that there were gender-specific books for us in the Bible. And it's not that it doesn't apply to women, but it's a man's book. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If you've ever had this conversation before, you'll recognize this kind of interaction. Men and women are just different in certain ways, right? And so if a woman comes home, if she's been away, if she's been at work or whatever, and the husband says, "How was your day?" That starts a lengthy conversation. It starts, oh, you know what? I was driving to work this morning. Before I ever even got there, I saw in the car next to me was Mary, and I hadn't seen Mary since the 5th grade, and I was so excited. We were waving at each other. You know what? We were in 5th grade, and that, we hadn't even gotten to work yet, right? And so that's how a woman answers the question, how was your day? If you ask a man that same question, what is the answer? Fine. Thanks for asking. That's the way that men tend to communicate, and Mark is a man. Mark is a man's man, and so he doesn't go into elaborate details. He just hits the facts, and he does it really quickly, and then he moves on to the next story. That's the way that Mark is organized, and so even if you were to open Mark and think, you know what? I bet Mark is like some of the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I bet it's like some of the others, and it probably tells us the Christmas story up front. And if you were to notice, there is no Christmas story in the book of Mark, you might say, well, Mark, what's going on? I thought you would tell us about the birth of Jesus. And he would probably respond with something like, oh yeah, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Let's get on to the stuff that matters, right? And so that's what he does. In chapter 1, he talks about the baptism of Jesus and the temptation of Jesus. He talks about Jesus hanging out with people that we would think Jesus shouldn't be hanging out with. The tax collectors, the sinners, the prostitutes, people that the religious folks looked at Jesus and said, why in the world are you hanging out with him? Chapter 2 is quick stories of Jesus healing people. There's a paralyzed man who gets healed. And basically Mark's story is something like this. There was a guy who was paralyzed. Jesus healed him. Let me tell you the next story of what Jesus did. So it just, it's just quick facts and moves from one thing to the next. And the story that we're going to look at this morning is only 6 verses long. It's really quick, it's really short, but it has a lot of stuff that I think will point us in the right direction for influencing those that are coming behind us or underneath us. So Mark chapter 3 is where we're going to be. We'll just start in verse 1 and walk through this. So like I said, he's just told us just kind of a rapid series of stories, and here's another rapid story that he adds into this. It says this: another time he, meaning Jesus, went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. I want to stop here for just a second and just explain something, because I think this is pertinent. I actually was having a conversation with somebody this week about God and science, and just kind of asking the question, how do God and science fit together? I mean, that the Bible says that the world was created in 7 days, and then I hear about evolution, and how does all of this work? How does all of this fit together? And I just want to remind you at this point in the story that this book was not written to be a scientific book. In fact, the way that we think about science, the way that we have hypotheses and theories and all that, about in a period of history called the Enlightenment. And these books, these letters were compiled long before the Enlightenment was ever around. And so while it may give us some indication of science, this is not intended to be a science book. And so in this story, we start off and it says there's a man with a shriveled hand. And that's all that it tells us. And in our minds, we may kind of want more detail. Well, what do you mean he had a shriveled hand? So for us, it may be explaining like, there was a man who had an atrophied hand. He probably, we don't know this for sure, but probably had an injury to his hand at some point in time. Maybe he broke some bones and the bones were never set back correctly, and so he couldn't use that hand, and so the muscles started to draw in, and his hand became atrophied, right? We think in all of those terms where the Bible just says, just accept it, he had a shriveled hand, okay? That's what it was. And so it just tells us there was a man in the synagogue where Jesus went who had a shriveled hand. In verse 2 it goes on and says, some of them, and again Mark moves really rapidly, so don't miss who he's talking about. Some of them is the people in the synagogue with Jesus, the religious leaders that are there with him. It says some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. I don't know if you have been around the church or if you have not. If you haven't been around church, you may not be familiar with this, but way back in the Ten Commandments, there's something that God tells the people of Israel. He tells them, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. You're supposed to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? And so what these guys are doing, the religious leaders are looking at Jesus and they're really asking a question. As Jesus is there with this guy with the shriveled hand, they are wondering, is Jesus going to heal this guy? And more than that, they are wondering, is Jesus going to break the rule? Is he going to work on the Sabbath? Is he going to be a rule breaker and do his own thing, or is he actually going to follow the rules that we've always been taught, that we've always understood to be right and to be true? And I think this is because if influence still is this question. They follow the rules. Isn't that what we I mean, teachers about their students. At this point, we're asking the question, the right answer, did you follow the rules to do it the right way? You know, did you do your parents' old way of math, or are you using the rules of Common Core math to get the answer that you got? And so the question becomes for teachers, are you following the rules, right? And then they ask the question, did you do your homework? Did you turn it in on time? Are you following the rules? And for parents, it's the same question. Did you clean your room the way that you were supposed to in the time that I told you to do it? Are you following the rules? Are you getting off your electronics, getting off your tablets, putting down your phones, all of that stuff at the right time? And again, that's just the same thing that always comes up. It comes up in different forms, but the question for those that we're influencing typically is, are you following the rules? Now, if you're a grandparent, you basically, the parents don't like you as grandparents because you teach the kids don't follow the rules, right? You give them things they're not supposed to have at times they're not supposed to have it, and then the parents have to retrain them later on. But even grandparents, to an extent, they look at their grandkids, and if they see their grandkids doing something they're not supposed to be doing, they cringe on the inside thinking, oh, they're not following the rules. They're my grandkids, and they're not doing the right thing right now, you know? And that's the way that we typically raise kids, is we raise them with the mindset of, if you're going to be happy, if you're going to be healthy, if you're eventually going to be independent, you're going to get there because you followed the rules. Isn't that the way it works most of the time, right? But Jesus is coming along here, and he's having this interaction, and the religious leaders are asking the question, but if you're kind of seeing where the story is going, if you're a kid sitting in here, you're probably thinking, I think the preacher's about to tell us we don't have to follow the rules. This is maybe the greatest church ever, right? I love it. And if you're a parent sitting here, you're probably thinking, I think he's telling my kids they may not have to follow the rules. I don't think we're ever coming back to this place again. Let me just tell you, I'm not saying rules are bad, okay? I'm not saying don't follow the rules, but I think Jesus has something bigger that he is going to point out to us about the rules in this context that we're looking at it in. So hang with me, follow the story. Don't get too excited or too upset yet, okay? Just listen to what happens in the story. In verse 3, it says, Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. And I'm just imagining here, but I'm thinking, you know what? If I'm the guy with the shriveled hand, this is probably a fairly small town. They didn't have big towns in Israel at this point. Jerusalem was pretty big. They don't have big towns. So the guy is there, and he doesn't want attention drawn to himself. If I've got a shriveled hand, I don't want to be called up and, you know, hey, show everybody your hand, right? But Jesus calls him up and says, I want you to stand up here in front of everybody in the synagogue. I want you to get right in the middle of this debate. So there's a debate between Jesus and the religious leaders. And so we don't know exactly why. Maybe the guy with the shriveled hand was a good rule follower, and so he does what Jesus tells. Maybe, though, it was more than that. Maybe this guy is a guy who knows enough about Jesus that he is willing to take a risk. If Jesus says, you ought to come do this, maybe he's the kind of guy that's looking at that and he says, you know what? If Jesus is about to do something, I want to be in the middle of it. If he is about to do something amazing, I want to see it happen. And so for whatever reason, the guy comes forward and becomes kind of the center of attention. And Jesus asks this question. Verse 4 says, then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to kill? I mean, there are times where Jesus asks hard questions, right? There are times where he says things and we're just like, where are you going with this, Jesus? This is not one of those times. I mean, he just asked a very basic question. What's the rule? What's the law say? Is it the law that you should do good, or is it the law that you should do evil? What does the law say? Should you kill somebody or should you save their life? I mean, probably the youngest kid in the synagogue could answer this question, right? This is not, Jesus even gives it to him in a multiple choice format, right? So he lays this out for him. What's the right thing to do here, guys? To do good or to do evil? And he starts this idea of what the law is for. As he does that, really the question that Jesus is getting to is, who is the law for? Is the law created to benefit God? Or is the law created to benefit man? Is the law created to benefit us? In fact, Jesus, if you read some of the other Gospels that tell the story, they are more of the female version. They stretch out the details a little bit further. And Jesus in those Gospels asks the question, if your animal, if your donkey falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, kind of the same implication of, if your child gets hurt on the Sabbath day, are you not going to do whatever you can do to help your child? Right? And so Jesus is setting up this question for them, and he's asking, for the benefit of God, or is the law for the benefit of us? Another way for us to think about that in our context is, again, if you are a parent, let me ask you this question. When you decided to have kids, did you make the decision to have kids because you looked at the surroundings around you and said, you know what, we need to have kids so that there will be somebody here to pick up the toys. That's why we need to have kids. No, you don't ask that question. That's ridiculous, right? You probably don't even have toys on the floor if you don't have kids to start with. And so the same question is applied with what Jesus is saying. He's saying, did God create people just to have somebody to carry out the Sabbath? No, that's ridiculous. God didn't create people to carry out rules. The rules are here for our benefit, not for God's benefit. They're for our benefit. And I think what Jesus is pointing them towards is he's pointing them towards this big idea that as you deal with those that you're influencing, make sure that they understand it is way more important to know God than it is to know the rules. It is way more important to know the heart of the rule maker than it is to know the rule itself. That is what matters. That's what we need to be instilling in those that we're leading. Because if we do it the other way, what do we end up with? If we raise kids that are absolutely great at carrying out the rules, if they know every rule and if they carry them out perfectly, what have we accomplished? We actually raise kids that maybe become religious leaders, but they miss Jesus altogether. And that's Jesus saying, that's the wrong goal. It looks good up front that you would say, I want my kids to follow the rules, but that's the wrong goal. You shouldn't want kids that follow the rules. You should want kids that fall in love with the God who created the rules for us. Our behavior doesn't change just because there are rules out there, let's be honest. I mean, we all know, every one of us, in every one of our lives, we know there have been rules that we have walked through, and we knew we were doing it at the moment that we did it, right? The thing that changes our behavior is not the fact that the rules are there. The thing that changes our behavior is falling in love with God. That's what makes all the difference. And Jesus is just reminding these people, you need to stop overemphasizing the rules. Now, they're not bad. They're there for your good. But you need to stop overemphasizing those and start overemphasizing the fact that you need to know God. That's what you need more than anything else. And so, I like to kind of put myself in these situations. I like to imagine that I would have been there in the synagogue with Jesus, and what would happen in that moment if Jesus said this. And in my mind, the way that it should go, it's kind of like a movie, where Jesus makes this incredible point about knowing God and loving God, and he's about to heal this guy, and you see that coming. And I almost picture that there would just be one guy in the synagogue that would just start the slow clap, right? And then slowly everybody else would start the clap with him, and they would join. And pretty soon the whole area is just applauding Jesus. Wow, that's amazing, great stuff. Thanks for showing us that, Jesus. But that's not what happened. That's good stuff, Jesus. They don't even do that. Listen to what it says here at the end of verse 4. It says, but they remained silent. Even though they knew the answer, even though they knew where Jesus was going, even though they knew how important this was, they just sit there and look at Jesus like, man, you have lost your mind. You're crazy. Telling us that the rules are less important than something else. In verse 5 it says this, Jesus looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out, and here's the second part of their response. So then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So not only was there not this huge round of applause for this incredible thing that Jesus just showed them, but their response was, first of all, silence, and second of all, how do we get rid of this guy? We need to get this guy out of here. And this, just as a reminder, this is Mark chapter 3. This is like the beginning of the story. They already despise Jesus for the things that he's telling. And so they go out, and the Pharisees connect with this group called the Herodians. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But the Pharisees were a religious group who had... So the Pharisees wanted to make sure that someone from the line of David would always be a king in Israel. That was part of their interest. The Herodians were a political group that said, we want to make sure that someone from the line of Herod the Great is always over this region of the world. And so these are two groups that are politically completely at odds. The Pharisees say, even though we disagree with them, even though we don't like them, we are going to form an alliance with them because this guy Jesus is telling us stuff that is absolutely crazy. We're going to form an alliance to get rid of him. That's how serious they were about it. And let me tell you something. I won't say this gently, but I want to say it in a way that you fully understand. If you are raising those that you have influence over, with the idea that the rules are the most important thing in life, you are slowly killing Jesus to them. You are taking them to a place where they are going to miss out on a relationship with God because they are so concerned about the rules. Again, please hear me. I'm not saying rules are bad. They are here set up for our good. But if we focus on the rules over the relationship, we are missing what matters most. We're missing God. And so the question becomes, how do I do this? How do I focus on the relationship? How do I let my children and the kids that I'm influencing, the students in my class, the nieces and nephews that I have, how do I let them know that a relationship with God is more important than the rules? And I would say to you that this is the perfect time of year for this conversation. This is the perfect time to start changing the way that we do things, because think about it. Everything in society right now is telling our kids, pay attention to the rules. In fact, there are elves that are popping up in homes all over the neighborhood here and all around the city, right? And they're popping up on shelves, and the whole reason that the elves are here is to say, I'm watching you to tell Santa what you're doing. I'm keeping an eye on you to make sure that you're following the rules, right? That's why the elves come. And then there's this other creepy guy that's a little bit older guy. Maybe he's looking in the window at night. I don't know where he is, but he knows when we're sleeping. He knows when we're awake. He knows when we're good. He knows when we're bad. And so you better be good, right? If you want something, then you better. Everything in society right now is saying, pay attention to the rules. What a perfect opportunity to take those that we have influence with and say, maybe it's more important to know why the rules exist. Maybe it's more important to know the heart of the rule maker than it is just to know the rules themselves. I had several parents after the first service who walked out and said to me, so that my big takeaway is that I failed as a parent. And let me tell you, that is not what I'm saying, okay? That is not the big idea here. And so maybe your kids are already grown. Maybe your kids are out of the house. Let me just remind you, you're still a parent. Your kids still look to you as their parent. And so maybe it's not just the conversations that you have. Maybe it's not just saying, let's know the rule maker and not just the rules, but maybe it's that you're demonstrating to them what it looks like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. You're demonstrating to them what it looks like to have a relationship with the rule maker and not just following the rules. But what a perfect time of year for this. Perfect time of year to emphasize to those around us that this time of year reminds us that our God came not to implement a bunch of new rules, but he came because he wanted to be near you. He came because he wanted to interact with you. He came because he wanted to know him. And that's why he showed up 2,000 years ago. Not just so you would follow the rules. Not so he could say, I see you when you're sleeping, I know when you're awake, I know everything about you. But so that he could tell you, yeah, I know that, I know all that stuff about you, I know the good you've done, I know the bad you've done. And you know what? I love you desperately, regardless of what you've done. And I want to know you. I want to know you so much that I'm willing to leave my throne in heaven, to wrap myself in the flesh of an infant, to live life as a man, so that you could know me and that I could know you. It's so much better as a goal than saying, I just hope my kids are happy and healthy and one day are independent. I think God sets this up and says, this is one thing you need to instill in children while they're still young so that they understand the way to relate to me as they grow old. Next week, we're going to continue this series. We're going to look at the second big idea, and I think this is one that you don't want to miss. Again, it's just countercultural according to what everything in our society tells us. And next week, I also encourage you to be here because during this time, first and second services, we're going to have kids that will be up here doing a Christmas program that they have been working on for the last several weeks, so you don't want to miss that. Come back next week and let's look at big idea number 2. Pray with me.